Good afternoon and welcome to HireRight's webinar, Managing Substance Abuse in the Workplace. We are glad that you could join us today. I am Ashley Kirchmart, Account Analyst for our Drug and Health Screening business here at HireRight, and I will be your host for this event. HireRight prepared this presentation for informational purposes only and is not intended to be substituted for legal advice. Should you have any legal questions, please direct them to your legal counsel. Before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. We will not be providing copies of the slides today. However, we will be sending out an email tomorrow with your HRCI insurance credit and a link to the recorded session that you can listen to at your own convenience or share with your colleagues. If you're experiencing any audio or visual issues, please refresh the browser window by pressing F5 on your keyboard or let us know through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. After the presentation, we would appreciate getting your feedback. Please take a short survey. Let us know if this session was valuable and if you have any ideas for future topics. HireRight's speaker for today is Dr. Todd Simo, HireRight's Chief Medical Officer and Managing Director of Logistics and Manufacturing. You can review his bio in the speaker folder. Dr. Simo, I'd like to turn it over to you now.
Great, thank you, Ashley. So again, thanks everybody for signing up for this. This is a little bit of other slant. This is going to be a very data-heavy presentation to basically show you the value of your drug-free workplace program and potential ways that you may consider enhancing it based upon your risk mitigation profile, your risk tolerance, so to speak. So, the agenda items here are pretty straightforward. What's the reason for testing? Are you doing it just in pre-employment? Do you have a for-cause testing program? And for-cause is a term that I use that essentially bundles together post-accident drug screening and reasonable suspicion drug screening. Because in both cases, there is some sort of trigger event, like an injury, an accident, or articulable observations of, so to speak, impairment that basically triggers you by company policy to do a drug testing, alcohol testing event. We'll talk about, random testing as well as return to duty and follow-up testing after a person, potentially has a violation of your drug or alcohol policy or comes forward and says, hey, I have a drug or alcohol problem, and you send them through your EAP program, your Employees Assistance Program. So again, what does that look like, and what's the value of that type of testing? And then I'm going to review the different specimens. So any of you that have, listened to my webinars before will know that we have a considerable amount of data on the different positivity rates from both a lab and MRO perspective for urine, oral fluid, and hair. And I'm going to then talk about, how do you test safety-sensitive employees, and does that differ in regards to how you test, non-safety-sensitive employees? And the last part of this will actually be recommendations for your drug-free workplace program. So the first part here, I guess there isn't an animation, so everybody will get this question right. But, what's the general purpose of a drug-free workplace program? Is it just to promote safety? Is it to just maintain employee productivity? Is it a measure to decrease healthcare costs? Or D, a punitive program to catch bad employees and fire them? So, as you can see here, from this question, and I'm sure everybody would have gotten it right, that it's really a program to promote, safety, improve productivity, and reduce overall healthcare costs. So now that I talked about that, let's look at the data that supports it. So again, there's citations on the bottom here, but substance abuse users are 5 times more likely to have a workplace injury, hence file a workman comp claim. The U.S. Department of Labor found that employees using drugs or alcohol contributed to the majority of on-the-job accidents, so 65%, with 40% of all, industrial workplace facilities being caused by individuals with a substance abuse disorder, whether that is alcohol, the number one drug of abuse, or one of the other drugs of abuse, such as marijuana, cocaine, methamphetamine. And then, a study at 7 different trauma centers for a 2-year period of time showed that 54% of drivers involved in a severe motor vehicle accident where there was a serious injury or death tested positive for drugs and or alcohol, with the two most prevalent, drugs being, alcohol at 22% and marijuana at 25%. And these were blood studies. So these were blood studies done on autopsy for the most part. And therefore, the prevalence of people, with THC in their blood and having a fatal accident or a very severe accident was, in this study, higher than alcohol. And then there's studies out there that if you mix the two of them, marijuana and alcohol, your risk for accident, goes exponentially up. The next group of data is on productivity. So the last is on, workplace safety and kind of general safety overall. From a productivity perspective, people that are a substance abuser, again, whether it's alcohol or drugs, we miss nearly 5 weeks a year due to absenteeism, just not showing up to work. Their substance abuse interferes with them to get up in the morning and get into work. The National Council of Alcohol and Drug Dependence, estimated that alcohol and drug misuse cost the United States over $81 billion a year in lost productivity. So that's a data point that you'll see a great deal in any of my presentations. And in fact, the Obama administration used that data when they looked at the overall impact of drug use on society as well as employers. And again, a study by the National Drug Intelligence Center, at the Department of Justice, found that, substance misuse accounted for, $49 billion in reduced workdays. So, over half of that $81 billion from the line item 4 was actually, just not showing up to work, with the other group, or with the other part of that $81 billion, being people just not working at their appropriate efficiency. So now that we talked about safety and productivity, the last part is healthcare costs. And I have a couple citations here. The University of Chicago discovered that someone who's using drugs essentially costs the employer twice as much from a healthcare perspective. So, that substance abuse, causes them to have more health complications, as we would expect, and therefore have higher healthcare costs. And again, the healthcare cost, that's burdened by employers, for people who are substance users, drives their healthcare costs up to the tune of $25 billion a year. So, a big number there in regards to the costs that employers are shouldering for substance abuse, abusing people, on their medical plans. So again, this is Obama administration data, and this is a slide that you'll see in several of my presentations. But, the overall impact of illicit drug use, on the employers is in the tune of over $190 billion a year, with the National Institute of Drug Addiction estimating anywhere from 10 million to 14 million people actively abusing, a drug or alcohol being on a job site. It comes out to, $14,000 a year whenever you detect, deter, and then eliminate, that drug user from your workplace. And when I say eliminate, that sounds like a very harsh term, but, I'd like to clarify. Eliminate is not hiring terminating, or rehabilitating. I'm a strong advocate. At the last National Drug and Alcohol Screening Association, I did a presentation on the value of a good employees assistance return to duty program. There's a big return on investment for those types of programs. Being able to retain those employees that you've already invested a great deal in, makes sense financially. And therefore, really considering having that as part of your overall drug-free workplace program is something that I encourage. So let's look for the reasons for testing. So the one, that, I'm sure nearly everyone does that has a drug-free workplace program is the pre-employment drug screen. And really that pre-employment drug screen is by definition a post-offer test. So you're doing it after a conditional offer of employment has been made. The intent of the pre-employment, drug screen is to dissuade drug-using donors from applying. So this is a deterrence measure. And your whole drug-free workplace program should be set up to deter people from using illicit drugs, and not just there to try to find the one bad person. Like I had in the first kind of question and answer slide, drug-free workplace program isn't there to all of a sudden go, wow, this is a bad employee and I'm sure he's using drugs, so I want to do a drug screen now just so I can, take employment action against him or her. That's not really it. The whole program is set up to deter essentially that bad employee from ever applying with you, or once they do apply with you, not get sucked into using illicit drugs or alcohol inappropriately and then coming to work. So again, that's really, the whole intent of that pre-employment test is to, keep that, person from applying. However, most pre-employment tests are a scheduled event, meaning it may not happen immediately after, you do your conditional offer of employment. So you may interview the person, go, wow, Bob or Sally, you're a perfect candidate for this position. We'd like to offer you a job, but doing so, you have to pass the drug screen. And guess what? You have the next 2 days, 3 days, whatever that registration or so to speak, scheduling time is to go to a collection site and get your drug screen collected. So since it is a scheduled test, the donor can study for the test. So I went through some data already in the first several slides, and I'll give you a data point that you can cite as me as the source. And it is 10 out of 10 people doing drugs know it. And therefore, if they need, a job and that job requires a drug screen, there are several mechanisms they can do to pass that test. So there's literally millions of websites out there devoted to beat the drug screen. So there's several subversion measures, particularly for urine, where you can, so to speak, game the test, study the test, and have a false negative test. One way that's very common now is buying synthetic urine off the internet. So this is a yellow fluid that oftentimes comes with a heating element. So when the donor presents the urine to the collector at the collection site, since these are non-observed collections, the collector will see a yellow fluid that looks like urine and is in the 95, 96 degree range. So it looks perfect from a collector perspective. That collector, seals it, the chain of custody is executed, it goes to the laboratory, and the physical parameters of that yellow fluid meets all the physical parameters that the lab looks for in regards to urine, drug screen, specimen validity, and therefore, there's a negative drug screen. So that's a very common way. And when I talk to friends in the industry that are lab directors at large drug screening laboratories, they come out and say that they know every day that they have a batch of synthetic urine that is cycled through their lab, because they'll have, one run of 500 specimens where 50 specimens have the exact same, pH, acidity level, specific gravity, and creatinine. And that just isn't, so to speak, typical. So it's like they win the Powerball every day. So they know there's synthetic urine that's going through the lab. They just don't have any regulatory way to start looking for other stuff because how the labs are set up and the rules that apply to them. So again, when you look at our MRO non-regulated tests, so these are for all the non-DOT tests, when you look at the pre-employment positive rate for those pre-employment tests is 2.5%, MRO verified positive. However, if it was a current employee test, either due to random testing or for cause testing, i.e. reasonable suspicion, or post-accident, that rate goes up to 4.4%. So it doesn't quite double. Now, some of that can be selection bias, and we'll actually walk through that in some upcoming slides because you would certainly think post-accident and reasonable suspicion tests would have a far higher rate than pre-employment. So let's look at that for-cause test. And again, the definition that I use for for-cause testing is an employee is mandated to test based upon a trigger event, something that happens at work, like a workplace accident, injury, or articulable observations of impairment. So that person, has a drug screen, so to speak, mandated that they do. And again, from a non-negative perspective, and I use our September data, which is around 100,000 non-regulated drug screens, those tests positive rate was 7.2%. So again, fairly big number. If it was post-accident, it was lower, sitting at 5.7%. If it was reasonable suspicion, it was pushing on greater than 1 out of 4, nearly 28%. And then when you compare that to the pre-employment, positive rate, you can see that the rates more than double in the post-accident arena and essentially go up more than 10 times for reasonable suspicion. So again, there's people that are able to pass that drug screen pre-employment because they're given that scheduling window. But once they become an employee, if they have a test mandated by a trigger event, they have started using again and putting your workplaces at risk. So how do you maybe decrease that, for-cause positive rate? Well, the one thing is random testing. So again, by definition, a random test is a test done randomly, that every employee within a random pool is subject for testing over a period of time. The employees don't get any prior notice, so there isn't a scheduling window. So the employee isn't said, hey, you're on the random list and get this test done by the end of the week. It's really, hey, you're on the random list. It's Thursday. You're going to the collection site right now. It's part of their duty that day to head to the collection site. The employers need to make sure that whatever program they set up basically is fair, and everybody within that random testing pool, it has an equal likelihood to be tested. So if you set up your random pool that, 20% of my employees in this pool should be selected, annually, therefore, every time there's a selection, the person should be eligible. So if they were pulled during the first period, they can be as likely to be pulled in the second period. That's what makes it random. And when I look at the HireRight, again, non-DOT MRO verified, positive testing data, it shows that the overall positive rate for random tests was 3.2%. Now the post-accident rate, positive rate, when you compare the clients that have a random program compared to the clients that don't have a random program, nearly has a 2-point difference of 4.9% positive rate in the post-accident arena for people with a random program compared to a 6.6% positive rate for those that don't have a random program. And this data is fairly consistent month over month. So if you have a random program in place, you typically have less accidents. And if you have an accident, you're less likely that person is positive. Now, here's some just sundry other data. We don't manage every client's random program. Of our clients within our database, around 8% of them are using us as a random testing administrator. So we're doing the selections, they're doing the testing through us. However, these typically are our larger clients, because even though those clients only represent less than 10% of our clients doing drug screening with us, their testing volume is nearly double of that, at 16%. So these tend to be larger employers that test more often. So here's the return to duty and follow-up test. And return to duty and follow-up test was terms used by DOT, and it meant specifically for people who are returning to duty after a drug and alcohol violation. If I was talking to DOT-regulated employers, solely I would be telling them that every return to duty and follow-up test by regulation, needs to be observed, because that's part of the DOT rule. In talking to you all, that's not a recommendation that I make unless you are DOT regulated. But my recommendation here is strongly consider a program that looks, helps people who made a mistake, had a problem. Once they address that mistake, own their issue, come back. You give them an avenue to return to work and have that as part of your overall policy. So again, when I looked at the September data, of those return to duty and follow-up tests that were done, they were really not a whole lot different than the pre-employment positive rate. So again, these are people that had a drug problem that once they address it, aren't that much different than the normal, so to speak, candidate out there. And again, there's all sorts of data on return on investment of a drug-free workplace program. But when you start looking at it, there's a 23%, gain when you look at employees making, kind of close to the federal minimum wage. So they're on the lower end of that pay scale at under $45,000. The more they make, the higher the percentage of return on investment. So when you're making close to the median wage in the United States of $60,000, your return is over, is in the over 60% range. So let's review the different specimens. So from a review of the different specimens, there's three predominant specimens used for workplace testing: urine, oral fluid, and hair. So this is the HireRight data. Now this blends both our non-regulated testing and our DOT testing together. All DOT testing is falling under the urine line. At this point in time, oral fluid has been approved by DOT. For testing, however, there's no approved labs at this point, and we're still waiting, for the first lab to be approved and then to roll out any kind of DOT oral fluid program. All the oral fluid and hair testing is all being done for non-DOT reasons, so essentially company policy reasons. But as you can see here, both alternate specimens, whether it's oral fluid or hair, well outperform urine testing. So again, urine is the specimen that's been out there the longest. It is considered the gold standard for testing. Whenever the FDA is approving another workplace specimen, it is looking at urine as so to speak, the standard. 94% of our testing volume is in urine. You saw that the positive rate in 2023 for urine, which include DOT testing, was 2.6%. If I eliminate the DOT tests, that MRO verified positive rate goes up to 2.9%. But again, that remains markedly less than the other two specimens. It does have a very large collection site network with a bunch of electronically enabled sites that really give an ease of use for the employer and the candidate or donor. And it also has the broadest panel options. If you want to add something like peyote, or magic mushrooms to your testing panel, that's fairly easy to do in urine and not so easy to do or maybe impossible in oral fluid and hair. When you look at, oral fluid is their second most common specimen, but far behind urine, sitting at about between 5 and 6%. The positive rate there is nearly, 6% overall, so double of that of urine. However, there's some variation in this data. Around 33% of our oral fluid tests don't have THC in the panel. And those tests have a markedly lower MRO verified positive rate, sitting at about 3.5%. So it still outperforms urine, but if you all of a sudden add THC into that oral fluid panel, that the MRO verified positive rate approaches 9%. So big difference depending upon the panel type. And always remember that oral fluids detection window for marijuana is less than 24 hours, and the known occupational impairment window caused by marijuana use is well over 24 to 36 hours. So if you smoke pot, you have trouble with higher brain functions such as spatial discrimination, i.e. how far away from something you are, as well as multiple task tracking, i.e. Noticing everything in your peripheral vision or in your environment. And the last thing, which is also critical, is rapid decision making. Being able to know what you need to do when you see something in front of you, and that your ability to react as fast is diminished. So, oral fluid, I think, is a great mousetrap and really an indicator of potential impairment. However, at this point in time, if you are dependent upon needing a collection site to do it, it does have a very limited collection site network. And really the only place to reliably be able to get an oral fluid drug test done at a collection site is in California or Washington, based upon those two states at the beginning of this year saying if you want to preserve your right to test for THC universally in the non-DOT arena, you have to use a specimen that looks for an active form of THC, so a psychoactive form of THC. And oral fluid is the only specimen, on this page that actually looks for, delta-9 THC in its parent, kind of normal psychoactive form, whereas urine and hair looks for the metabolite, which is not psychoactive. Now, there are a lot of testing options. Oral fluid, very recently only was a 5-panel test. But over the last decade, it has, included multiple other analytes that can be added to that panel. Now, hair testing is something that coming out of the pandemic, we were closer to, 2%, 3% coming out of the pandemic of clients doing hair. That has diminished greatly over the last 3 years. The hair testing just has fallen out of favor for a lot of employers. A big reason for that is, based upon it was truncating their candidate pool. And coming out of the pandemic, a lot of companies had a hard time just getting, people to apply. So therefore, they looked at the one to retain their drug-free workplace program. But since oral fluid was truncating their, candidate pool, they rolled that back, and that those percentages essentially went back to urine. Or that percentage of clients went back to urine. It is an observed collection. It does have around a 6% MRO verified positive rate. It was the exact same MRO verified positive rate as oral fluid in 2023. So you have one specimen that has a detection window of, maybe a couple days, compared to another that has a detection window of, 30 to 90 days, depending upon hair length. But the MRO verified positive rate is about the same. And we'll go over some of the specimen differences in terms of detection in upcoming slides. Again, there's an adequate collection site network. It's certainly much better than oral fluid, but not as broad as urine. And again, there are testing options to include, close to 30 different analytes that you can test in hair. So again, when you look at the ideal, client profile here, urine certainly wins the ease of use score. There are known state issues with urine. So, this is something the federal government has had urine as its specimen since the Omnibus Transportation Act of 1991. It has a very large collection site network with a very large array of different panels. However, the biggest issue is specimen dispersion, hence why the MRO verified positive rate is markedly lower than that of the alternate specimens, because it's just really hard to so to speak, study for an oral fluid or hair test. Now, oral fluid, I'll be very frank, is right now, my favorite specimen. It is ideal for clients, customers that have static facilities where the people they're hiring or their employees come to work every day. So I always think about, manufacturers, logistics centers, warehouses. These people are coming there every day. It's not like they're a remote workforce, and therefore you have a easy ability to collect those people. The collector training for non-regulated oral fluid testing is quite simple. The manufacturers of the devices, such as Quantisol, have essentially 10-minute training videos or less than 10-minute training videos. I think it's like 7 minutes and 40-odd seconds of, basically showing the process in which a donor collects the oral fluid on him or herself. And then the collector's really there to observe the donor collecting that oral fluid, as well as to assure the chain of custody process. As I said before, the collection site network is currently exceptionally limited. However, as there are labs that are, once a lab becomes DOT approved, or there's labs that become DOT approved to do oral fluid, the collection site network will blossom, over 2025 and 2026 once those labs are approved by the National Lab Accreditation Program. And now the last specimen is hair, the longest detection window. So again, hair testing looks for a window of detection anywhere from 30 to 90 days. Each half of inch of hair represents a 30-day window of detection. And therefore, if you have 1.5 inches of hair, you have a 90-day detection window. If you have, a foot of hair, and the collector's only going to send in the first inch and a half that is closest to the scalp. That's the only part that's tested. So again, that's what gives you the 90-day window. To provide a hair specimen, you do have to have at least a 1/2 inch length hair. Therefore, there are people out there that I'll just say are hair challenged, but especially on the head. So alternate collection sites such as body hair can be used in other places, like in males, the chest, armpits, and such. Hair testing really detects lifestyle use. So again, it's looking for someone who is more of a, daily drug user or more habitual drug user. Pre-employment specimen, and I'll say the best pre-employment specimen would be a hair test, because you really can't study for it at all. If you have an oral fluid test pre-employment and you're not collecting it, so to speak, at the time of the post-offer or time of the offer, and you're saying, hey, go to a collection site and you have 3 days to go there, that donor, all they need to do is not use drugs for 3 days and they'll be negative. So you're really not getting a true sense of what that person's drug use is. Whereas here, that, so to speak, detection or that scheduling window can be far longer because there's no real time element involved here to get them to the collection site immediately. So therefore, if you say, hey, you have to get this test done, we'll give you a week to get it done, you're certainly not missing any drug use because it takes about a week to 10 days for the hair to grow out the head anyway. So therefore, it's not time sensitive. Again, it does have the highest donor fear factor, and therefore, it limits the candidate pool. So as I said before, with my statistic, 10 out of 10 people doing drugs, well, those 10 out of 10 people are very concerned about hair testing because when you go out on the internet, you'll see on the different, so to speak, blog sites and things where people are like, yeah, you should watch out. And again, there's that great deal of fear because they believe that kind of sporadic use is very readily detected. And therefore, they'll generally not seek employment, if a company is, or not seek employment with that employer if a company is using hair tests. So when we go to hair testing panels, from a panel perspective, there's the traditional 5-panel test, which mimics the DOT test, where we're looking for, delta-9 THC, so the substance formerly known as marijuana. So in the drug testing world, we're looking for delta-9 THC, which is not cross-reactive to delta-8 or delta-10 or CBD. Therefore, it's just looking for that, major psychoactive component of the cannabis plant. It's looking for cocaine, looking for amphetamines, which includes both amphetamine and methamphetamine. It is looking for opiates, which includes codeine, morphine, and heroin. And the last one on the traditional 5-panel is phencyclidine, PCP, otherwise known as angel dust. Now, the other typical standard panels that the labs offer are, a 7-panel test, which builds upon the 5-panel test with barbiturates and benzodiazepines. Now, there's certainly, if there's some healthcare, people on this line, this is certainly not all the barbiturates and benzodiazepines, so to speak, available. The labs do kind of truncate the amount of sub-analytes within that class that they are testing for. And then when you go to 9 and 10-panel tests, the things that are being added to that are typically methadone, propoxyphene, and methaqualone. So let's look at a couple of those. And this is, 2 drugs that persist on many companies' policy saying, hey, we test for methaqualone, we test for propoxyphene. My recommendation here is if you do have that as part of your drug-free workplace program, you are truncating the specimens that you can use, as well as your collection site network and some availability and flexibility in your program. Plus, you're really not adding any value to your program since both of these drugs, as you'll see on this, were discontinued. Methaqualone was discontinued and placed in a Schedule I drug category in 1984, and there's been no laboratory positives for decades. And therefore Quest, in fact, it is available at Quest, but it's not part of any Quest standard panel. So you actually have to pay a substantial upcharge to add methaqualone to a Quest drug screen. Propoxyphene on the other line, was banned by the FDA in 2010. So it wasn't moved to a Schedule I category, but it was banned. It's a opioid, and it was an opioid that caused, heart arrhythmias. So certain people's hearts to go into a rhythm that may not be compatible with life. There are other opiates available that didn't share this problem. Therefore, it was removed from the market. Quest is gracious enough to share their data every year as part of the Quest Drugs Testing Index. And I would recommend anybody, if they're kind of interested, to look at the data. Quest slices it in several different ways. But if you look at the lab positive rate over the last 5 years for propoxyphene, it is sitting at 0.000%. So no positives over 100,000 tests. So again, it's one of those things that if methaqualone and propoxyphene remain as part of your drug-free workplace program and part of your policy, this is an opportunity to potentially clean that up, talk to your employment lawyer about removing that to give you more flexible testing options and potentially a cheaper drug screening program without losing any return on investment. Now, beyond the standards panels, there are typical additions that we see, such as expanded opiates, which is looking for the synthetic opiates like hydrocodone, oxycodone, and their metabolites. My general recommendation is, only add expanded opiates if your employee group has access to those. So you're in healthcare, you're in manufacturing where you're actually manufacturing hydrocodone or oxycodone. Those would be obvious add-ons. I don't recommend adding it on to every employer just because you can, because the vast majority of these get overturned on medical review. Hydrocodone is the number one prescription, in the United States, or last time I looked, it was, in regards to its being, so to speak, prescribed for both chronic pain issues as well as, in cough syrup formulations. The next group over are ecstasy, so MDMA, MDA. Again, the positive rates here are exceptionally small. These, so to speak, rave drugs, party drugs, aren't detected in urine all that long. And generally, I don't think they add a whole lot of return on investment to your testing. And in the non-regulated, non-DOT arena, they are, they do cost extra. And I don't believe you get your return on investment for having these as part of your program. And the last that I'm getting a lot of questions on is fentanyl. It is not a common add-on. However, the Department of Human Health Services that regulates the federal panel or makes says what can be on the federal panel did put out a notice of proposed rulemaking to add fentanyl to the federal panel. It has, from an industry perspective, I do sit on a couple committees at the American Trucking Association, and from an industry perspective, it was, broadly recognized as a good thing. However, I basically said, fentanyl is a bad drug. Fentanyl is killing people. The people bringing in fentanyl either from China or from the Mexican border, generally coming from China, are putting people at risk, and they are killing people. The societal impact of fentanyl is enormous. However, from a workplace perspective, last year we did over 100,000 tests where a client included fentanyl in the panel, and the positive rate, as you can see here, was exceptionally low. So, my basic recommendation is don't have it on your panel unless you have a compelling business reason to do so, because it is a fairly expensive add-on to your drug-free workplace panel. We're talking about an add-on of $10 or more to that testing price. So panel recommendations, unless you have a compelling business reason why not to do it, I believe the 5-panel test is the best test. Any additional, analytes, cost you money and time. So there's more that will be presumptively positive at the lab that will fail to confirm on reconfirmation testing. There'll be a fair number that are, positive at the lab after confirmation testing that are overturned on medical review. So your overall turnaround time is worse when you do those expanded panels. Now, the one industry that I universally say should test, those expanded panels are in the healthcare arena, just because healthcare workers do have access to these drugs, and you want to have a deterrence effect. So, doctors, nurses, medical assistants, pharmacists aren't, so to speak, diverting drugs from the patients to themselves. Now, for safety-sensitive laborers, I do not recommend removing THC from the panel unless you're compelled to do so, by state or local law. So again, there's really 5 states that prohibit, marijuana smoking either explicitly, like New York, for all test reasons other than reasonable suspicion, like Minnesota for pre-employment, unless you have some of the very limited carve-outs. New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Montana basically say you really, if a person's positive, you can't, terminate them. You can't remove them from your job site. So again, it's better not to know and not be able to take action on it. So, and there's also now, Pittsburgh that says you can't test for it if the person's a medical marijuana user. You have Philadelphia that says you can't test for it pre-employment unless they meet one of these safety-sensitive carve-outs. So again, the landscape out there is somewhat messy. But again, it is messy but still limited to 7 jurisdictions. So again, if you are in the safety-sensitive labor space, I do recommend that you continue to test for Delta-9 THC. Now that I've talked about safety versus non-safety, sensitive, let's dive deeper into that. So again, my definition of a safety-sensitive laborer is an employee who works in a position where a simple lapse of judgment can have a catastrophic effect on that employee, his or her coworkers, and or the general work environment. So again, that's my definition. States vary in regards to their definition, so I recommend that you know your state's definition of safety sensitive, because in some states, safety sensitive means that if the employee can hurt his or her coworker. In other states, it just means that they can hurt, him or herself. So again, knowing that will help you, have that appropriate, testing panel in place. And again, for safety sensitive employees, the big 3 drivers that I talked about before, safety, productivity, and healthcare costs are in place. So, the return on investment, for drug testing safety-sensitive employees, safety is number one. Safety is number one by far. But then you have productivity and healthcare costs. Non-safety sensitive employees, again, my basic definition is a white-collar worker. So an employee who performs a professional administrative or managerial work. It may be a retail employee you may consider as non-safety sensitive. But there are, some white-collar, laborers that are safety sensitive. If you are the chemical engineer, in a lab that's responsible for, adding the, determining the mixture of chemicals, well, you may be safety sensitive. If you're that nurse that is delivering medications on a hospital ward, you're certainly safety sensitive. So again, there's some overlap here, but these are just kind of general categories that at least I could wrap my mind around. Now, safety is less of a concern with these laborers, right? They're non-safety sensitive. They're not in a position where there can be catastrophic effects to themselves, the coworker, or the general work environment. However, productivity, and healthcare cost drivers remain the same. Further, if we're talking about, retail, shrinkage is a big problem. Or if we're talking about accounting, shrinkage is a problem, i.e. people stealing from their job sites. And there's a study here from the early 80s that found about 1 out of 4 people that are using cocaine were diverting funds from their employer to afford, so they could afford their habit. So what are my recommendations? So for safety-sensitive laborers, so those people that simple lapse in judgment that have a catastrophic effect, I highly recommend that you test, pre-employment, that you have a 4-cause testing program, but you also can, if you don't have a random program in place, consider a random program. because the data is there to show if you have a random program in place, you have less accidents, and if you do have an accident, drug use tends not to be, as common. And then again, I encourage, return to duty and follow-up programs. So, i.e., have a program in place that if a person has a violation of drug or alcohol policy or comes forward and says, I need help, that you have a mechanism to retain that person as long as that person, owns their problem, as long as that person works with, the counselor, the treatment facility, whatever, to rehabilitate themselves. Anybody can have a problem. Anybody can become addicted. And therefore, giving, a person that you already invested a great deal of time and money into, giving that person a conduit to be eliminated from the drug-using workforce, but still part of your workforce, shows an enormous return on investment, and those employees tend to stay with that employer that gave them that second chance. So from a specimen selection perspective, even though people have moved away from hair broadly, I'm still a hair testing advocate for safety-sensitive employee in the pre-employment setting. It has the longest window of detection. It catches lifestyle users that tend to put your job the most at risk. It has that, long window of detection, so you really can't study for it. And I believe it has an enormous return on investment. Plus, the drug screen that actually has the highest return on investment is the one you never collect. So if you all of a sudden, publish on your, website that we have a drug-free workplace program, we do hair testing pre-employment for your safety-sensitive laborers, for all those people that don't apply, that are using drugs, you're still saving your organization $14,000 a year without spending anything for a drug screen. So, from the next perspective, I'm a big fan for, for-cause random, return to duty, and follow-up testing using oral fluid, due to that, robust, positive rate, MRO-verified positive rate, and the ease of use. If all of a sudden you have a random program and you're at a factory and you have 10 people that need to have a random test, well, it's pretty easy to pull that person from the line and get them back to the line within 15 to 20 minutes if you're doing oral fluid tests, rather than pulling them from your production line, getting them, to a clinic where they have to wait to provide a urine specimen to then come back. So again, your ability to maintain your workflow using oral fluid is far better than the other specimens. And again, if you do have safety-sensitive laborers, but you really need a dynamic collection site network, urine is the best specimen. Urine has a very robust network of clinics that map all over the United States that, yes, there are some areas like parts unknown, Wyoming or New York, or name the state, where there may not be a collection facility close, but there will be collection facilities. And from a panel selection perspective, for safety-sensitive laborers, I recommend the 5-panel test, including marijuana, unless it's prohibited by a state or local statute. I only, recommend those additional add-ons like ecstasy if you have some sort of tangible, compelling business reason why to do it. And again, the last part of this, even if you're in New York or Minnesota, Montana, New Jersey, Rhode Island, if you have a person that has a for-cause testing event, so you have a trigger event that leads you to believe that impairment may be in play, and guess what? In most accident injuries, you can make a case that impairment could be in play based upon, drug use, alcohol use causing, more erratic behavior and therefore unsafe behavior. I say keep Delta-9 THC on the panel. Again, unless strictly prohibited, and there's none of those states that have any prohibition on you testing for THC when you have reasonable suspicion. The non-safety sensitive laborers, right here, I recommend that we can, you truncate the random test. I think it has less of a return on investment here, just because you're not in an environment where that post-accident test could be catastrophic. But keeping the other test reasons the same. Specimen selection for those people at a static facility, so perhaps a call center or a retail facility that you want to drug screen for using oral fluid, if they're coming in for that job interview, I think is an excellent specimen. And then using oral fluid for the for-cause and return to duty and follow-up testing if possible. But if you're not willing to train your collectors, you need a dynamic collection site. Urine program works very well in this arena. And again, from a panel selection, these are the areas where I say, hey, you may want to consider taking, delta-9 THC, aka marijuana, off your panel. Again, the productivity, loss will still be there for that marijuana using person. However, since that safety element, that catastrophic event element is taken out of play, from a risk mitigation profile, you're probably willing to accept a bit more risk than a safety-sensitive employer. Therefore, removing it certainly isn't hurting your safety, and therefore you can consider it. Again, the adding of additional analytes is the same. Only do it if you have a really compelling business reason why you're doing it. And again, for all for-cause testing, so even if you don't test for it in the pre-employment setting, any of your for-cause testing should include delta-9 THC as part of that panel. So Ashley, I'll turn it over to you for closing remarks. And I can take a couple of questions here before I have to jump off at 3 p.m. Eastern time.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Simo. So we do have a couple of questions. In terms of opiates on the side panel, does that include all synthetic opioids?
A standard 5 panel does not include all synthetic opioids. That's one of those, expanded opioid panel add-ons. So again, I would recommend that when you're talking to your drug screening administrator provider, that if you want to add hydrocodone or add oxycodone, that you just add it as a bundle of expanded opiates, because you can tend to get both all of the testing done for a cheaper price than if you add one thing or another. Now, there are oral fluids that the standard panel includes hydrocodone, so there's a lot of variations there. But my general recommendation is if you want to test for hydrocodone, that you ask for it in expanded opiates and get oxycodone along with it, because that typically is your cheapest option.
Thank you. Another question is, so if I'm in New York, can I test for marijuana?
Can you come again with that? I didn't get the first part.
Oh, sorry. The question was, if I am in New York, can I test for marijuana?
If you're in New York, the New York statute says you can not test for delta-9 THC, marijuana, for non-DOT drug screens. So DOT, you have to test for it. You don't have the option to remove it from the panel. But in New York, the regulation there is you cannot test for THC unless you have reasonable suspicion. And in New York, the smell of THC on a person isn't enough to compel reasonable suspicion. So you need other, contemporaneous articulable observations of mood, behavior, or appearance that causes you to so to speak, pull that trigger event and do a test that includes marijuana, delta-9 THC. Ashley, why don't you do your closing wrap-up of all the other stuff that you need to information you need to give them?
Okay, sounds good. All right, any other questions from the webinar will be addressed by email. Thank you for attending today's webinar. We will be sending out an email tomorrow with your HRCI and SHRM credits. Please don't forget to take our short survey. We are glad you joined us today, and have a wonderful day.